what we see as a mechanism for change in mineral exploration and mining is these international reporting codes, and what can be done there to generally improve what we now know as ESG performance, environmental, social and governance performance, from companies on the ground undertaking these activities.
John and I will be your hosts today.
In fact, the clue's in the name really. It stands for innovative, non-invasive and fully acceptable exploration technologies. Over 3 years, a group of partners from around Europe have been focusing on the technology. We've been looking at drones, helicopters, all sorts of innovative geophysical techniques. But alongside that, in parallel, been focusing on the acceptability and what defines acceptability and what needs to be done for exploration to be acceptable within a European context. The project's focused Europe-wide, but it has sort of gone into rabbit holes really, or focused in on three reference areas. One in Finland, one in Germany, and one in Spain. In terms of acceptability, the barriers and challenges that we've found over the 3 years have been fivefold. Existing land use comes up again and again and again, whether that be land use that's for recreation purposes or for agriculture or other industry. The negative perceptions of exploration and mining, those have just grown throughout the project, with the last year of the project actually, not our project, but other EU projects doing similar research, having open letters written about them to the European Commission, complaining about social aspects and the lack of engagement, and complaining about exploration and mining in Europe. And this is quite pertinent and important really, because for the first time in Europe, you've had networks of dissenters against mining, range from projects in Northern Ireland through to Finland, through to Romania, working together and collaborating together to cohesively to complain against mining. The cost of mineral exploration, this is also an important issue. Most of the mining in Europe is not publicly listed. It tends to be private funding, and that funding is hard to come by. And so the role of the resources and reporting codes within that is something which is I think is very relevant to the discussion today. Environmental concerns continue, that they always have been, and I think they always will be there. But European legislation is incredibly robust in terms of environmental concerns. And then governance processes. You have the EU legislation, but then you have subsidiarity and you have the national legislation. And for the most of Europe, and in particular the most of the EU states, they are members of the OECD, which means that what is known in other parts of the world as good international industry practice. From the social aspects of the project, we've focused in and we've pulled together a vision for what is required for mining to be acceptable within a European context. And where the reporting codes sit is really within that finance and industry sector, what is done, what is their role actually in I suppose opening gateways to finance.
Perk is Europe's very own reporting standard for mineral resources and reserves, last updated in 2017. And it's particularly good to have Perk here because in the 2020 Crisco AGM, Perk was asked to start to make progress or take the lead on producing a template, if you like, or a prototype for new reporting codes which include enhanced ESG reporting.
When we're referring to Crisco, that's the Committee for International Resource Reporting Standards, which is a grouping of 16 national bodies around the world, including the likes of JORC, and we've got KCMI and MPI GM on this panel here. At the Crisco AGM last September, because we'd started work on this, we were asked to if you like, go ahead with updating the Perk reporting standard to show one example of how extra guidance could be incorporated. And the first step in our update was to realign the Perk standard, which had been last issued in 2017, with the 2019 Crisco template. And then we have kind of a list of things that have accumulated over the last 4 years, and obviously one of the important ones was environmental social governance. So, and with assistance from Catherine and Sarah, and also correspondence with Teresa in South Africa, who was the lead, has really led the way with the SAM ESG guidelines. You know, so we're all, if you like, all the international bodies are kind of trying to learn from one another, and if you like, we kind of leapfrog along. So the idea would be, when we issue the Perk reporting standard, before it can be adopted by Perk, it has to be shared anyway with the other national organizations, and you know, there would be a chance for additional comment. We thought the opportunity came because the INFAC project finishing off, that we could have this international discussion now and share ideas, and perhaps discuss one or two of the items we've come on that, you know, have well, are still under discussion, let's say, so we can take international input before deciding ourselves in Perk on what we'll put in. The modifying factors in the codes, which, if you like, are considerations that have to be taken into account when we consider sort of geologically what's in the ground, which we would refer to as the mineral resource, when we wish to convert that into what we could economically extract, which we would term mineral reserves, or for the Australians, ore reserves. But that's where we would apply considerations like the prices and the costs and everything. And there have always been the concept that environmental, social, and legal and governance governmental aspects would be part of the modified factor. Even though a lot of the European countries have historically had important mining industries, the current generation aren't as familiar with those. Yeah, so the other change in the codes would be saying that you have to consider these aspects right from the exploration stage. It's you know, that they're relevant there. All of us in Crisco and Perk, and I think Jork, you know, most of us are doing this voluntarily on our own time, because we're all volunteer-run organizations. And Perk, as you see from there's 6 logos behind me. We're a grouping of 6 professional organizations. A general question for everyone is, are you happy with figure 1, or do you think figure 1 should somehow indicate that you have to look at modified factors, and in particular ESG, before even reporting exploration results?
When we're talking about our mineral resources and reserves, I mean, are these constrained to your stereotypical base and bulk metals, or is it something which is broader than that? So what is the scope of this, and does Perk differ from any of the other standards and codes from around the world?
Or a lot of the companies that have adopted the Perk standard are actually industrial mineral or cement companies, and that would differ, say, from Australasia and Canada. And those changes initially introduced in the Perk standard have been incorporated. If you look at the 2019 Crisco template, you will see there's an appendix on I don't remember the title exactly, but there's an appendix on industrial minerals, and there's an appendix on dimension stone, and they essentially have arisen from changes that initially came in the Perk standard and have, if you like, propagated upwards to the Crisco international reporting template. The one other change that we were going to make, which sort of arises from Catherine's presentation, was that there should be reference to looking at modifying factors, particularly the environmental and social ones, right from the exploration stage onwards.
From Canada, we've got the CIM, Canadian Institute for Metals and Mining, and they've been working on since about 2017 to produce environmental and social best practice guidelines. It's still under revision.
A well-needed guidance on governance is really the focus. You have to have the governance to hit the environmental and social on the head. So I think it's really key that we get our heads around that and move that forward. So we're going back to principles, and we're going to be pointing to all the great guidance that's already out there on environmental and social practices.
I was mentored by the guy who created the phrase social license to operate. And I don't know if he brainwashed me or indoctrinated me or drugged me or whatever, but for 25 some odd years, sustainable development, CSR, ESG has been part of the mantra. And it's really refreshing and hopeful and enlightening to see so many people focused on this. I think part of that indoctrination was instilled an aspect of the governance and the importance of governance that relates to a certain hopeful degree of culture within our global mining industry and maybe one day global village. The knowledge that we carry as an industry and avocational practitioners here as well, I think many of us might agree or disagree, perhaps as well, is that our environmental knowledge has grown considerably. Technical knowledge is really quite good. There's certainly room for improvement. Social is the challenge. We included a section for it, social and environmental, but it hasn't really been enforced and held, people being held to account for that. So even through the upgrades and the changes to 43-101, including the last one in 2016, there's been a greater and greater focus on that. What was interesting is my involvement as an industry executive, that greater focus actually came from the financing side. And not so much the investment side. It was more on the loan, because the banks really wanted to see some degree of security. If we consider corporate governance, that changes from owner to owner. Project governance is something that can be passed on to community, and they have a degree of certainty because they're the ones who are in fact your greater risk. And in that, therefore, should be a modifying factor. And in that aspect, time is a modifying factor as well. Because when we're looking at electric vehicles or whatever we want for economic or social or structural development in the world, our access to resources and that clock is an incredible factor as well.
By increasing, having more of the ESG incorporated into all of our codes, that's definitely going to increase public confidence. So we're looking to each other to get to a better end result.
They have developed some ESG best practice guidelines in 2017, and I think that there's some really interesting conversations to come from CIM, particularly with some of the feedback they've given on whether the G should be a separate part of the ESG. You know, we should have ES and then G. I think that's a really important thing to discuss, and probably one of the areas under greatest debate at the moment. You know, should these reporting codes even be considering governance? Is it their place to do so? What even does governance mean? Are we talking about national governance or corporate governance, previously known as CSR?
You did ask about, where do things like free, prior, and informed consent come in? That's a very, very important question. It's a burning question here. Ideally, from a First Nations or an Indigenous people's point of view, it happens at day one, and that's long before there are reserves and resources. That would be the day that the geologist first turns up on the project. For many on the corporate side, this doesn't become, for them, a priority until they've got something in the ground, which is probably when the resources start to become reserves. And there is some reality. They say, well, when there's something real here, then we'll talk about it, we'll get serious. So there's a gap there. There's a gap that is going to continue to be a very controversial part of the relationship of the mining industry to Indigenous people.
Certainly, I think in Europe here with the Green Deal, Green Deal 2050, we're starting to feel a bit of pressure to see how exploration and mining can meet those objectives. And time is not our friend, actually, if we're going to produce those critical raw materials in a responsible and socially acceptable way. We do need to get moving on the acceptability issue. So JORC has been doing some really interesting work. JORC is it's a Joint Ore Reserves Committee in Australia, and I think we're also represented here by AusIMM, the Australian Institute of Mining and Metallurgy.
The last update of the JORC code was in 2012, so it's now 8 years old. There's a few rust spots, you know, the odometer's getting wound up a little bit. And where we are is we've just really started our engagement process with our stakeholders to get comments around areas to review, suitability, concerns, etc. So I've launched an online survey in December. We will be reviewing that, going back to stakeholders a number of times, setting up some working groups, but our intent is to have a new code by the end of the year. The changing legislation in Australia between perhaps states and the federal government, they're not always aligned, but there is a tendency for reporting codes to become part of formalised processes. The community consent process has changed remarkably, over the last 10 years. There's no one model. It's sometimes legislated, in fact, outside of the mining lease process. So it can be a completely separate government process of reviews and the like. Environmental standards, like everywhere, they continue to evolve, and some of those get hard-coded into legislation, some of them aren't. So what's the right thing to be doing, and where are the things there? And last but not least, we tend to talk about ESG, but the changes to investor expectations, and as came out of the last session there, that actually really does mean about project financing too. So if you don't have those people happy, you can have all the rocks in the ground you like, and you're nowhere.
So last year, as a result of that work and a forum we held in 2019, AusIMM developed what's known as its social responsibility statement. That statement refers to a framework. The framework includes the existing Royal Charter for AusIMM, its Code of Ethics, now the public statement on social responsibility, and now the defined areas of practice competencies for environmental professionals and social performance professionals. We've had environmental performance professional recognition for some time, but now social performance is in there as well. Our position is that at some point it will be necessary for people to sign off on ESG factors. In fact, it's already necessary for project financing in major projects that have equator bank financing, or like some of the projects I've been in, IFC financing. So, you already have to have people who know what they're talking about across a full suite of ESG matters.
A very brief background about the KCMI code. This is a quite young code, even though that it was introduced in 2011. It has been updated back in 2017. For your reference as well, that the code is used both by the publicly listed company and also by private companies. The ESG aspect within or inside the reporting code, it's something that needs to be, discussed very deeply and intensively. All the reports to the government now has to comply with the KCMI code. So this is something that is not quite new, the ESG, but it is something that probably can be new for a company if it has to be put inside the reporting code. I think some of our colleagues were mentioning about the motivating factor that's already covering the environmental and also social. And for your information, in Indonesia, that all the project that has to go to the productions, they have to pass not just the feasibility study from technical and economical aspects, but also from environmental and social and some extent governance as well.
CAMRA is the China Association of Mineral resources appraisers, and understand like it's still working towards joining CRISCO, and will likely get a CRISCO template compliant code launched around the half two of this year, 2021. So very much looking forward and then to see how the board of camera is working on, and to find out more about the detailed policies or regulations hopefully will be embedded, especially for ESG, because currently in the current the camera code, there are very limited terms actually clearly addressed for ESG. There are definitely a few terms regarding to environment, considering about like the MEE, the Ministry of Ecology and Environment. They do we do have these environmental laws, and for all the mining companies, they have to apply to apply the mining license or exploration license to reaching the certain standards under the environment law. But that's why there are more environmental terms in the current the camera code, but there are limited. There is also very limited like a social terms addressed in the current version, and there's basically like no G in the current code.
As you may know, the China is right now we have a new code. And for the Chinese mining community or mining industry, we always say we have the two markets. The one is the market inside of China is a very big demand, and another is international market. So the future plan for us, this is a very important. We need to at every geologist and all of the mining company to know the new code. So we published this new code already half year. So in the next step, we need to really need to do all the promoting for this new code. We really need to keep the balance for the ESG. I think not only the environment, but also the governments, also the social matters. So need to really urgent to call the international collaboration. So this is, I think, the second plan for us. I think the third is in this year we are planning for a new international meeting or summit to make a new open door policy for the mining community or mining industries to open to not only the policymakers but also the industry. So we need to in the same community or same platform to dialogue and to really to working together.
I'm on the site and kind of waiting for the permission to get a drill permission from the local social community. So that's the challenge. And then in here in Mongolia, we have the exploration and geology work. Even mining is facing very difficulties from the local people. And as well as government. So that's the thing. I was thinking that Catherine was talking about anti-mining issue as well. So the anti-mining, I heard in Ulaanbaatar there's a parliament member is actually making an anti-mining campaign. I'm not talking about international things. International things, we all are talking about international good practices. But the people in here, or maybe everybody, needs the practice in their local area would help to understand, and that's a good thing.
We're looking to remain relevant within the minerals industry. We're looking to assist our members, whether it be small junior companies, whether it be explorationists, whether they be large mining companies. We want to make everything relevant to people who are actually out there working in the field.
We have our SAMES guideline, which, as John mentioned, sort of became officially part of the SAM codes suite of codes from 2017. Development of it started in about 2013, 2014. And the guideline exists as a guideline because it provides clarity to CPs on how to go about integrating ESG into their reporting. What we're working on now is really saying at each point along the value chain, what does it mean? What kind of information should you be accessing it? In certain instances, where can you find that information that's freely and publicly available to help you understand, for example, your environmental or social risks in more detail? And then how do you actually apply that? Because ultimately, SAMESC is looking for integrated determination of resources and reserves. And you can only do that by sort of distilling the huge amount of information that exists within the world of sustainability reporting and looking at it through the lens of mineral resource and reserve reporting. We haven't seen as much adoption of the SAMESC guideline to the extent that we would like, and I do think part of that is because the guideline doesn't provide enough guidance. It sets out sort of what you want to see, but not necessarily how to go about doing it.
We're also looking at the importance of providing guidance for other modifying factors, and specifically the integrated risk management, something that we also feel is lacking in many of the codes and has a great deal to do with information recovered from the ESG factors. Another thing that we're concentrating on is how to sensitize our competent persons to the importance of ESG. We want people to comply with ESG, not simply because it's the right thing to do or because somebody has a big stick, but rather because it's something that they believe ought to be reported on in a responsible and sensible manner.
They have a relatively new regulation, which was formally adopted in February 2019. It's known as SK 1300, the Modernisation of Property Disclosures for Mining Registrants. Now, a big difference here compared to some of the other codes that are joining us today is that whilst those are codes or guidance instruments, SK 1300 is a law which is enforced by the US Security Exchange Commission.
In 2018, in fact, it was the SEC passed the new disclosure standards, but they didn't actually get promulgated across into the Federal Register until early 2019. And so they became law and binding on all mining exploration companies as of 1st of January this year. And that actually is now law that the US and foreign registrants listed on the various US exchanges have to follow when undertaking mining disclosures to the public. So much of what's covered in the new regulation is said by the SEC to be CRISCO compliant, but there's also a number of topics of particular interest to the SEC themselves that they've woven in and out and throughout the SEC guidelines. So for nearly 40 years, the US used a code called Industry Guide 7. It was fairly simplistic. It was a guideline. It actually wasn't binding. It was just simply the SEC asked you to do it. They would point to that particular document and they would expect you to follow. With SK 1300's promulgation, now we have a law. The document itself is about 400 pages, of which about the first 300 discusses the reasoning why the SEC came down on certain decisions and certain methods of presentation, and about 20 pages of it actually is what is required to actually comply with public disclosures in certain areas. And there's about another 2 pages that actually cover the content requirements of what's called a technical report summary, which is the SEC's version of a technical report under NI 43-101. Was that ESG disclosure is still voluntary in the US for all industries other than mining, but there's a lot more pressure to have these types of disclosures from institutional investors. So I'm expecting to see that as more of these technical report summaries come out into the public domain, that you'll see pressure coming on to other aspects within the United States to start conforming and bring themselves in line with what's required of the mining companies.
Governance is a system in place to maintain the integrity of a process. And when it comes to the SEC's new standard, the SK 1300, they're talking about the process of mineral exploration, mineral resource estimation, mineral reserve estimation. Those are the processes they're referring to. And they want to see internal controls over the process, which means a governance system. And that means you have procedures in place, you have checks in the system, you have oversight. And this also feeds back into civil liability defense, that if you have a good internal controls over your process, then you can show that as one of your due diligences. And even under the Canadian and parts of the US law, that gives you another defense that you have a disclosure control procedure in place.
The question always arises whether Crisco is a leader or a follower. In this particular case, it has to be a follower, and it takes the best from each individual code as they are revised. Just listening to this morning and to this evening's discussions, I think one of the most important things for me which we need to address is the definition of governance, project governance. We've got corporate governance, we've got social governance, which is in the template at the moment. So I think we need to just define what exactly we're talking about.
BlackRock are ingraining ESG more and more and more into their processes of investment across their entire diverse range of investment themes. And specifically within the mining space, they understand that mining can add huge value to the world. The impact that this could have on the mining industry driven by the investment world. I have spoken to lots of ESG related funds and impact investors. Almost exclusively, they do not invest in mining. Some of them are not allowed to, some of them are allowed to but choose not to. So the huge tidal wave of money that has gone into these investment themes in particularly the last 24 months, but longer than that, is basically like a jet stream going above the industry. We are being completely ignored by huge new pools of capital.
I think that sort of context-driven approach is really crucial, particularly with this ESG topic. You can standardize mineral reporting, but this is going to be a much bigger challenge to come to a consensus with. But it's great to see that the willingness is there, and there's a real desire from everybody that's here today to collaborate internationally. You know, speaking as a geologist and as an economic geologist, understanding how ESG translates into modifying factors for mineral resources and reserves is going to be a really interesting area of development.
Acknowledgement that the earlier you start pulling ESG into this in a meaningful way, the better. We've heard this as we've gone around the world, depending on the jurisdiction and where the codes or standards sit relative to governmental governance, as it were, just to use all the words, what is or is not really possible in terms of bringing something that is dynamic and ever evolving, such as the social side.
The social issues, the social understanding, the social context, having effective stakeholder engagement from the outset should be seen as an investment rather than a cost.
2021 is actually an incredibly exciting year. What we've heard just now is that almost everybody is updating their code or standard or guidance right now. So there's an amazing push that's coming from our end. Also, as we can see from the international expectations perspective, there is that increasing need and desire to go from the greenwashing, as one of our attendees has just said, into true impact and action. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for your participation today.